Well, welcome. Glad you were able to come out here tonight. We appreciate you being here. And this was a tough night to come in off the out of the yard or whatever you may have been doing, enjoying this great weather. My name is Mike Well. I'm with Crosswinds Counseling. Crosswinds is a new counseling practice here in the north side of Indianapolis. We're part of a larger organization. We have an office in Fort Wayne, and a part of our organization also works with the Department of Child Services here in the state of Indiana. We have over 700 employees working with the state of Indiana. We are a Christian organization, and we hire counselors who are Christians who bring that perspective to their counseling, and so they bring to you the best practices and evidence-based therapies that will help, but also bring it through a Christian filter. My role at Crosswinds is I meet with churches. I help make churches aware of our services, create environments like this where we can come and share with people to help bring hopefully some information that's helpful to you in your life. And so I'm glad you're here tonight. I'd like to let him introduce himself. Grant Anderson. Grant is our lead therapist at our Indianapolis office. He has taken on that responsibility here in the last few months, and he'll give you a little background about where he came from.
Yeah. Thank you. As Mike said, my name is Grant Anderson. I'm a licensed mental health counselor, about 13 years of experience in the field. Started off in substance abuse world, then moved into residential, working at a boarding school. I'm actually with one of our boarding schools, actually down in the Dominican Republic overseas. So I did that for a couple years before I moved kind of up here and started working in social services. Really working with families that are affected by the Department of Child Services and juvenile probation. So a lot of economic poverty and just a lot of abuse, and kind of really put a niche into trauma. Became kind of what I worked a lot with. Kind of did a lot of private practice kind of all through the years here and there. And then as Mike kind of mentioned, kind of when our Indy office opened up, kind of stepped into that role here and been running ever since with that.
Great. Thanks, Grant. So we're fortunate to have Grant as a part of our team. We have 4 other counselors at our Indy office, and we're adding another one very soon to meet the needs of the area. Tonight, what we want to do is we want to focus on managing stress and anxiety. It's become a big issue in this COVID-19 world. We're going to talk a little bit about what causes stress and anxiety. We're going to talk about how COVID-19 has impacted that. Then we're going to talk about if you're dealing with stress and anxiety, what are some of the symptoms that may come across in your life? What are some of the ways you can identify? I call it like the dashboard of your car. What are the lights that may be lighting up that says the stress and anxiety is getting to me? And then we're going to give you some tools to help you manage that. We want to give you some different ways that can help you get some of that stress, some of that anxiety you feel, help you get it under control and to manage it. And then the last thing we'll talk about is what if those tools don't work? What if I'm still being affected about that? When should I seek additional help? So that's where we're going to go tonight. I want to start out, though, I want to talk a little bit about the spiritual aspect of anxiety, stress, depression. Matter of fact, 3 years ago this month, I went through a very difficult time with anxiety and depression and battling it. And so it became very real to me. But one of the things that I realized and recognized is sometimes when you're involved in the church, and maybe you can share with your friends, or you hear a message from somewhere, sometimes it's your Christian radio station, it's just talk about, the Bible tells you to be joyful and to cast your burdens on Jesus, and that stuff sounds awesome. And the problem is when you're wrestling sometimes with this anxiety, this stress, it's hard for your head and your heart to communicate that message. And sometimes it just becomes so overwhelming that even those words of what should be encouragement is to be joyful and to cast your burdens on the Lord actually become more guilt. It's like, God, I can't even get this right. I can't even cast my burdens on you. And the first thing I want to talk about tonight briefly is that this anxiety and stress thing, it's not something that God's going to condemn you for. It's not a sin. It's not a behavior that God is going to look at you and say, you're bad because you're doing that. And how do I know that? It's because I look at the Bible and I look at some characters like, if you remember Elijah, the great prophet. If you remember his story, there's one part in the Bible where he's literally going against 400 prophets of Baal, and they're dealing with trying to prove their God is more powerful. And if you remember the story, Elijah, even talks smack at them and challenges them, and God shows himself. And so you got this guy, Elijah. Elijah's just seen God do incredible things. And yet there comes a point in his life where a hit is basically put out on him. Jezebel puts a hit and a bounty out on his head. And for some reason, that one thing pushed him over the edge. And he takes off and he runs. And he gets to a point where he actually sits down and says, God, I'm ready to go. That's it. And yet nowhere in that story do you see God condemn that behavior. You see God call him out. What you do see is God work in his life to help him get through that time period. You look at Job, a man who God says is blameless and upright and everything. And we know the story of Job and what he goes through. And that one section, I still wonder how long that section of 40 chapters, how much time that actually is. That he's wrestling and struggling with questions of God, God's love, what God's doing, why he's going through this. And you can just feel the whole book. The stress, the anxiety, the depression. And yet never do you see God condemn Job. Instead, God is there. God shows up. And God helps him see his way through that. And finally, you look at David, a man after God's own heart. And yet over and over and over again, you see story of him going into deep depths. And we're very fortunate because he takes some of those feelings and he drops them and writes them in the Psalms. And we can still read about them today. We can go through and read those and go, yeah, I know what you're talking about. And yet again, God never condemns David for those feelings. He provides answers and provides help for David in those. So my first thing I want to share with you today, if you're here and you're a believer and you're struggling with this stress, anxiety, and maybe even some depression, God's not condemning you for that. God's not telling you you're bad for that. God's not saying that's a sin. God's looking at that as an opportunity for him to speak into your life and for you to find maybe a new part of your relationship with him, find some new trust. But sometimes it takes some help. We're going to talk about that tonight. Let's pray for a moment and jump into this. Heavenly Father, I'm so thankful for your love and grace. I'm so thankful that you understand that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, but sometimes the way we're made, things can overwhelm this body that you've created us. And so God, you give us tools and people and things to help us through these hard times. And so tonight, as we share and talk, I just hope my friends here tonight can find some encouragement, maybe some answers, some understanding for themselves or for a loved one that they're concerned about. But we just hope tonight, Father, that what we share will speak into the lives of each and every person here and those who may be online listening to this. We just thank you and praise you and ask you to be with us, Stephen. In Jesus' name, amen. So the first thing we're going to jump into is I'm going to ask for your help initially with this. There they are. We're going to basically first just hit some stuff that's kind of maybe duh kind of things. But what are some of the things in people's lives that create anxiety, stress? Money. There's the big one. Other things.
Kids. Relationships.
And we get into spouse, parents, co-workers, friends, so-called friends, other areas that we find challenging.
Their daily responsibilities.
And we'll just call that what it is. Work, bills, getting things done.
Like maybe it's a smaller stress, but the lids didn't fit on the
I
cups.
heard I created some stress.
There was a bit of stress there.
I'll be nice and won't go create stress over at Starbucks and tell them that. There's all kinds of things that happen in our lives that create stress. For me, even in this day, having a seminar, making sure we have coffee, making sure we have all the flyers. At home, I was trying to put in our house a reverse osmosis system. I woke up this morning and all those things are on my mind. And then that's not counting, well, I got to pay some bills, What else we got? What are we missing here, Brand? Anything more we get on this?
With work, I think just employment security, and then the commute. We have less issues with commute now, but commute to work.
So this came out of one brainstorm one day. What is it about work that makes work stressful? Getting up in the morning just to get to work. I grew up in Indiana. I graduated from high school, but in my 30s, I married a woman from Minnesota and had to do hard time in Minnesota. So I did 20 years in Minnesota. Getting up on a below zero day to commute 45 minutes to work ain't fun. All these things slowly pile up in our lives. And for most of us, at most times, we figure out ways to deal with it, to handle it, to manage it. But sometimes there comes a day when it just feels like it's too much. Again, back a little bit of my story. 3 years ago, we were in Minnesota, and we made a decision to move down here. And that triggered all kinds of things in my life. Because all of a sudden, I'm working, at that time I was working 2 jobs. I was working my regular job, and I was umpiring and refereeing sports every weekend for youth sports. Nothing anxiety-producing about going to referee youth sports at all. Not a thing. And all of a sudden, we're going to move, and all of a sudden, it just, too much. And so if we manage all these things, we juggle, we try to handle them, there comes sometimes a time when it gets too much. But what happened this year, so like your illustration you used the other day about what COVID-19 did to your cup.
So yeah, so we were talking about stress. And so, when we have stress, what happens is we don't have a lid for our cup. So it's a tiny little bit. It doesn't really make. But all of a sudden, financial pieces become stressed out. We can't make the bills. We're trying to figure out where the money is to make the bills. And so our stress goes up a little bit higher. All of a sudden, the kids are whining or screaming. They want food all of a sudden. And so our stress keeps going. And then all of a sudden, something happens like work calls, and they want to call you in on a weekend. And all of a sudden, your cup's overflowing now. And the stress and anxiety is just more than your normal ability to regulate and handle the emotions. So you throw something like COVID-19 in, and it's immediately making you start up here because all those stresses are there already because you look at kids, finances, work. Sometimes they're all combined right now for this past year. They've all been in the same place because all the kids are home and there's isolation. And so, your stress is already starting with you in the morning. So we've seen much higher levels of stress because of that.
So if you, at one point a year ago, felt like I was doing pretty good, what happened? This is what happened. We took what we learned to tolerate, what we learned to manage on a day-to-day basis. You've been able to handle almost in your way, and we threw COVID-19, a pandemic, something one none of us have ever been through. 2, obviously, government leaders, medical people, they've never been through it. So there was nowhere to turn to get any kind of sense of this thing's under control. And so tonight as we come, we're going to look at some other things. But the first thing I want to say is, if you're feeling this, that's not abnormal. It's not abnormal to feel like your cup is overflowing right now. Because we look at what we learned to manage. Maybe we've been able to manage before the pandemic, or some of us are having trouble managing this within. And we threw this other element in there. It makes us work from home. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. It sent our kids home to work and school. Again, a lot of people learn. They now understand why they're not homeschooling their kids. It's a lot of work. It's hard to keep them on task and moving. And so what we're going to move into now is we're going to talk a little bit about, all right, when this cup starts to overflow, all these things start to push over. What happens to you physically, mentally, emotionally? So once you start with the first thing, what happens, what am I going to notice physically if I'm experiencing this in overwhelming fashion?
So physical symptoms can vary from individual, and everyone's not going to necessarily present the same physical symptoms. The most common physical symptoms that we're going to see is headaches, fatigue, excessive exhaustion, a changing in your sleeping patterns or sleep issues in general. The muscle tensions perhaps tend to be the most common. People start to feel that tenseness. Weight loss or weight gain. And then another big one, which is what happened to me this fall, which was stomach issues. And so, for me this fall, it all culminated. I was out running, it's a good way to release stress and anxiety, yet still with COVID, it all just kind of boiled up, and I started to feel a pain in my stomach, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. So, I ignored it, like we'd sometimes do with anxiety or stress, just, ignore the physical symptoms. Went into work that day, saw Mike, and then within probably 15 minutes, I was like, I can't do this. I got to go home. The pain is just getting more intense. I think you mentioned I looked really white in the face. Ended up going into the ER at about 45 minutes after that. Went to the ER. They were not sure what was going on, so they're getting ready for me to do scans and stuff. And they're starting to put morphine into me, and it's not necessarily making the pain go away, and I'm starting to get overwhelmed, because that's what happens with stress. Sometimes we get overwhelmed, and so all of a sudden I'm in the ER because of COVID. I'm alone because my wife can't be there because of the restrictions, so she's got to be home with the kids. And so I'm sitting here thinking the worst possible scenario, which is what we call catastrophizing. We jump to the worst thing that's going to happen. I'm like, I'm dying right now. That's what this physical pain in my stomach is. It's going to kill me because no one knows what's happening. This is how you die. And so as it slowly gets worse and the pain medicine's not working, I start to do the worst thing you can possibly do. I start to actually breathe into the fear. And so I'm going, worried that I'm going to die. The nurse walks in, completely calm, just kind of gives me a look over and kind of comes in, and she's going to give me some more pain medicine. And all of a sudden, my limbs are starting to go numb, and they're starting to tingle, and I can't feel my legs now. I can't feel my arms, and I'm like, does she not see that I'm dying on the bed right next to her? Like, everything's going numb. She's not aware right now that I'm dying, and so I'm like, I better tell her so that she's aware that I'm dying. And so I let her know. I go, I can't feel my body. I think this isn't okay. What's wrong? She's like, honey, you're hyperventilating. Just slow your breath down. You'll be fine. Which, as a therapist who teaches people how to breathe appropriately for stress, it was a shock to me that I was doing it wrong all of a sudden. I was like, of course, that's what's going on. So I took my own medicine at that point. I tried to slow my breathing down. Within 3 minutes, my limbs returned to feeling. The pain started to slowly subside over time because the medicine started working better as I slowed my breathing better. Long story short, they didn't know what it was, so they sent me to my general practitioner, who sat me down, and he's like, we're going to do some blood tests, but tell me what's going on in your life. And I was like, well, I had some changes at the job. My wife just had a baby. And he's like, it sounds like you had a stress incident. And I'm like, no, I'm a therapist. I have really good self-care. That's what I do for a living. He's like, yeah, that sounds like you probably had stress that kind of came out in a physical symptom. So I say that because sometimes the physical symptoms are the last thing that we think of when we think of stress. We think of maybe muscle tension and tightness or just that emotional level. We don't always see the physical symptoms coming out, but it definitely can affect the course of your day, as it did for me.
So the other thing you can see sometimes is changes in your weight gain, weight loss that you don't expect. Those also can be indications of there's something going on in my life that I need to check out. Again, my picture of this is like your dashboard of your car. When those silly lights light up and you're wondering what that's about, what we're doing right now is just kind of pointing out these are some of the lights that they light up. So what are some of the mental things that I might experience up in my head?
We get more anxious in general, so that makes sense when it goes along with anxiety. But what we often see associated with the anxiety is depression. And so people who are coming in with anxious thoughts often have depressive thoughts associated with them. It's a very common connection, which we already have burnout, we have mental exhaustion. So you just kind of feel like you can't handle anymore, you're getting overwhelmed, your cup is overflowing to the point where it's like I can't put anything else in anymore because it's just coming out anyway. And as I use the cup analogy, it's important to realize everyone's cup looks different. So someone might have a bigger cup than someone else. So they might handle a lot more stress than other people, as we're just using it as an analogy. But you might also become more of a mental fog. Your brain can turn into a survival mode when it gets overwhelmed. So when it gets to the point where it's coming out, what happens is the brain shuts down, like it would with trauma, and only your frontal cortex is processing, which means you're thinking fight, flight, or freeze. And so we see that coming out. For example, for me, I just kind of froze, didn't really process what was going on at all with my body, and was just sitting in the moment, fighting internally, because my brain wasn't using all its brain processes to actually process. And then the last one, you kind of mentioned it before, but it's the rumination. When we get stressed, we tend to ruminate on that stress. I think bills or finances can be a good example of that. You have financial stress and your mind just can't stop thinking about that financial stress throughout the entire day sometimes. And it's one of the ways that mentally it just kind of exhausts us.
And like I say, all these come out different people. This rumination one is one that I experience very badly. When I go into a situation where I'm experiencing a lot of anxiety, my brain gets to, I call it the hamster wheel. And all of a sudden, all I can think about is this problem. I'm going to think of that. Oh, now there's that. And you get in this track that can make it very difficult. And so all these can be very different for each and every person. Emotionally, what am I feeling?
Yeah.
Inside?
I think the way that I tend to help people see the emotions is with high levels of anxiety, it kind of goes into a spectrum, and people will lie on both polars of the spectrum. So one down here would be like very high strung, irritable, always on edge. Everything sets that person off, all the way down to the bottom of the spectrum where they're numb, apathetic, just kind of walking through life as if nothing really matters. And both can have high levels of stress and anxiety, but they're handling it very different in emotional responses.
And then as far as we mentioned one of our stressors, relationships, how does that demonstrate in relationships?
Yeah, we can become easily irritated with people, and we tend to want to fight. One of the things that I realized we didn't mention up there was the impact social media has, and just the political climate, just people going on to Facebook just to talk and start arguments. And that's one of the ways that we see stress coming out right now is people are going on there, and some people aren't even commenting or replying, but you're still getting stressed by just reading the comments through. And we're realizing that stress is affecting us relationally without even us really having the intent to engage it.
You touched on social media. What are some of the things that you're seeing, that we're seeing now? How is that impacting adult lives, kids' lives? What are you seeing some of that?
Yeah, without getting too technical into studies and numbers and stuff, we have seen some of them. I guess I'll go into some important numbers, but since like 2017, more adolescents are experiencing anxiety and depression than any other generation before them, and they're seeking help more than any other generation before them. But they're also seeing, since 2011, they're seeing an uptick of the amount of technology and screen times that people are, and the numbers are pretty staggering because it was going up from like 2 to 3 hours a day of spending just on screens to like 4 or 5, 6 hours a day, and that's like 11 to like 13 or 14-year-olds. The adolescents are even higher than that, and they're recommending now that kids that are under the age of 5 don't even really look at screens. It's a lot harder to do sometimes. As a parent, we know that that's difficult, but that's where the research is showing us because of the impact screens are having.
And it's affecting each and every one, adults, kids, everyone, and especially as kids are being sent to spend screen time doing their schoolwork and those things. Spiritually, what might I be experiencing spiritually? What are some of the red flags spiritually I might be experiencing?
Yeah. So one of the things that people will come in to counseling with spiritually is when they're overwhelmed, sometimes the last thing you want to do is the best thing you can do, and that's turn to God in prayer or just open the scriptures. It's almost like that, I feel so overwhelmed, I don't want to go to where I know I should go. And people will sometimes obsess and think about that over and over and over. I recently had a client who was overthinking so greatly his relationship with Christ that he began to have what we call OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. And so his thoughts began to come out in compulsions to the point of anything I do could affect my relationship with God. If I don't sit on this side of the pulpit, I'm not going to be saved anymore. Well, if I sit on that side, then the devil's going to get a foothold. Like his mind had all of a sudden become so focused on the ruminations and the anxiety that he wasn't thinking straight. And so we see that spiritually sometimes, that the anxiety can so overwhelm the mind and the body that you're not able to think rationally.
And that's where, when those kind of connections are you have difficulty, that's where bringing someone else in to help you process that and look through that can be very beneficial. Because sometimes when you get thinking like that young man did, it's hard for him to take and fix it himself because he can't see where it's all broken down. So that's very important that you have sometimes someone who can identify and help you with that. One of the other areas that you'll see it play out is in work. Your productivity can change. Willingness to be at work on time if you find yourself late, long lunch hours, lots of stress, anxiety toward anything the boss asks you to do, wrestling with deadlines, all those things that are part of work that are normal can also become overwhelming and part of this whole equation that people can wrestle with. of outlined the problem, what's going on. We've kind of outlined the dashboard, what's going on there. What are some things that we can do that can help keep that cup from filling up quite as fast and overflowing? So what are some things we can look at there, Grant, that we can do on our own?
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful pieces can be just that support network, that's the social support we create. And so when you're identifying who could support you, you're looking for someone who's not just a good listener, but that is important, someone who's going to listen to what's going on in your life, but someone who's willing to, what we do, call you up or keep you accountable. So it's, hold you to what's going on, call you on your stuff. Sometimes, we see people trying to have social connections, but it's the wrong person. It's the person that creates the stress, the person that continues to add the anxiety on. And it's not necessarily helping them socially, it just continues to add more. So finding that person, finding that support network can be really impactful to beginning that process of how do I equip myself to have better self-care. And you'll see in a second why that's important, because if you start trying some of these things, you'll find that just like any new habits, they're not easy to do. But having someone who's going to be like, hey, have you been doing any of the habits that you're trying? Have you been journaling? Have you been praying? That accountability partner, that support person can kind of keep you focusing in the right direction.
So those relationships are important to find the right person. It may necessarily be a spouse or someone in your family. It may be somebody outside that, but you're looking for that person that can be honest with you, but not always brutally honest. You don't need somebody to beat you up. You do a great job of that yourself when you deal with anxiety. You need somebody to help you process and help you deal with some of the habits that we're going to talk about now. So what are some of the actual things that we can do on our own?
First one, a lot of these you'll sound like no-brainers, or they're not magic tricks. They're not meant to be like you do this one thing and you're no longer going to have anxiety in your life. It really is all habits. It's practicing these things, continuously using them, are going to give you a better grounding. To what happens is when you have your cup and it's starting to fill, these techniques will basically let some of that liquid out or let some of that stress kind of flow out to kind of release that tension inside of you. So the first one we'll talk about is just journaling. We've known for years the benefits of journaling. Not always the easiest for people, but the power of journaling is in the process. It's the ability to take something inside of you and take it out and put it onto paper. I was recently finding that there is research they're doing of the power of writing it out versus typing it out. When they're saying, the ability to actually write something, even one sentence a day by hand, actually has a greater benefit of health, was correlationally connected. One of the things we've been talking about is, journaling tends to be an art that we don't see younger generations picking up. They don't see them necessarily going to, maybe diaries or just writing things out. And, I've often thought one of those reasons is they're all keeping their own journaling and their life on Instagram, on TikTok, they're chronicling what's going on. The problem with that is what they're presenting is a fake image of themselves. It's not the real what's happening in their lives. And so it's as if you're taking a journal and you're writing out what you wish would happen versus what actually is going on in your life. So you're basically faking it into the journal. And we're not seeing it be very beneficial. We're seeing the opposite. So that stress, the anxiety of having to keep that image, and it's not just young kids and adolescents. Adults can struggle with that same mindset of I've got to have that perfect family, I've got to look this way, I've got to make sure my kids look this way, and it can be exhausting and stressful to do. And so journaling really provides an avenue for us to kind of begin to pour that out. Not necessarily a specific way to journal that has the most benefit. There's a lot of different theories out there, whether it's writing out gratitudes, what you're grateful for, whether it's just writing out what's bothering you, whether it's just processing, free flow of thought. I would say the benefit that I've seen is just being able to get to the journal. You're already going to start to see some kind of mental health benefit there.
That's great. Yeah, one of the things I've done that I like is just writing out the things that are going through my mind, the problems, the things, the due dates, the things that got to be done. To get that on paper, be able to look at paper, then I feel like I can take it out of my brain and I don't have to keep processing. But that's what I found helpful. So what's our next one?
Yeah, the next one is meditation and prayer. I think we all would agree the power of prayer, power of not just having that vertical communication with the Lord, but it's also a means to kind of have that release for mental health. One of the things that we see from David in the Psalms is he constantly was putting out his emotions into his prayer, and so meditation, not trying to be, Eastern. Really, we're looking at just that calmness, whether it's focusing on the scripture, focusing on a verse, just, listening in the silence. It's really just kind of keeping yourself centered or calmed. We find what happens is, when the rumination comes, it'll tend to come in those times. So that meditation and that prayer can kind of center you and try to clear your mind, in a sense, from what's going on. So there's a benefit there.
And another thing I found in prayer for me, writing it down keeps me from doing the rumination. Start praying, next thing you're on the beach in Florida somewhere. Writing it down helps me keep on track and keep on that. So what are some other areas that we need to?
So looking at sleep and eating habits together. No surprise that how we sleep is going to impact how we feel. Studies time and time for the last decades have talked about the need for 8 hours of sleep. And what we're seeing now that's new is a lot of us are using screens right before we go to bed, and then sometimes right when we wake up, it's the first thing we look at. And then the research is showing how hard it is for our brains to actually shut off and go into deep sleep when the last thing we do is screens. And the first thing we do is screens. It's not helping us wake up effectively. And so just that power of that routine before and after sleep can really have a good impact on your anxiety and your stress, which kind of goes right along into eating habits. Having healthy eating, what we put into our body is definitely going to affect how we feel. You were mentioning the prophet Elijah in that wilderness, and that's how God met him. God immediately had him sleep, woke up, he ate, and then he had him sleep again and wake up and eat again. Because if it's good enough for God, I would assume it's probably good enough for us as far as a coping mechanism.
And the other part of the sleep thing is making where you sleep a place to rest. So really want to discourage, if you keep your computer by your bed and you wake up in the morning and that's where you're going to do your work, or you're going to work at night, don't do it there. Because what you're doing is you're creating an anxious space and a place that you need to be able to relax. How many of you get emails on your phone from work? How many of you have ever, right before you go to bed, pick one up that's like, I wish I hadn't seen that till the morning. So sometimes those habits are just also safe for us. I don't need to know the complaint that came in or the project that was supposed to be done. We had 2 weeks now. I don't need that right before I go to bed. So even protecting ourselves and not making our bedroom a place of business is really helpful. Not only for our mental health, but probably for our relationship with our spouse. What else is good for us to do?
So exercise. That was what I was doing when I had my stress breakdown. So obviously it's not foolproof. It's not doing one of those things that's going to make, keep away a stress breakdown, especially if your cup's all the way at the top. But what research is showing us is 30 minutes of activity a day is really what's the most healthy. It's not necessarily about running, biking. It's really about just doing whatever you can, whether that's walking, whether that's taking the dog out. It's really just being physically active for about 30 minutes a day. Getting your heart rate up to a certain level is what kind of triggers the body's mental health benefit there.
So let's kind of move on next to what are some actual tools
Yep.
that we can use, some habits we can develop that can help us release some of this.
So the next one is one we'll actually kind of show you, and this is called muscle relaxation. So this is kind of one that we might teach at Crosswinds. And it's really basically taking your muscles, and everyone's going to keep stress a little bit differently in their body. Some people will keep it in their neck, some people will keep it in their shoulders or their arms, some people will keep it in their lower back. And so it's really basically taking the body and walking yourself all the way through to kind of tighten and then relax that muscle. If you find it difficult to think through which muscle, how to do it, there's tons of different narratives online that kind of walk you through that, but I'll kind of show you what I do that works. One of the things I try to do is just try to move from the head down, just because in my head that works, makes the most sense. Plus it looks the most ridiculous when I start it off, so we get that right out of the way. But basically it's tightening your facial muscles and then releasing those muscles, and then tightening the neck muscles and the shoulder muscles, and then releasing the muscles. And when you release the muscles, almost picturing mentally that stress just kind of leaving the body is kind of that goal. So if you're willing to try it with me, awesome. If not, that's okay too. But it's going to look a little bit like this. As I move to my neck, and then my shoulders. and you want to make sure you keep breathing throughout it because you can have a tendency to hold your breath. And then as you move all the way down, you can continue to move and stretch the legs out as you will. You just want to find a comfortable position. I always tell people, once you find what muscle or where you keep your stress, for example, if you don't keep your stress in your feet, you don't necessarily need to sit here and stretch your feet out. It might be nice to feel that, but it's not going to help the stress. It's where the stress tends to go in your body that tends to tighten on those muscles. So for most people, it's going to be in the shoulders and the neck, but not for everybody. So just knowing yourself and knowing where to go with that is going to be the most helpful. The next one we're going to talk about is a breathing exercise. Every single person in this room has gone through breathing because you wouldn't still be here if you couldn't breathe, so we're not teaching you how to breathe here. What we're trying to teach you is what I wish I would have done a lot better within the ER room, and it's how to take the body, reset it, and slow the breathing down. And so if you've ever Googled breathing exercises or if you ever looked into what, there's hundreds of different ways to do it. And every counselor will actually probably teach you different ways as well. There's what we call square breathing, following a square as you breathe. We teach star breathing, up and down as you breathe. There's different numbers associated with it where, breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 8 seconds, breathe in for 4, hold for 7, breathe. I don't get too caught up in the different styles because there's just so many. And I don't love the counting because I find that when I try to do the counting, for me at least, I get so caught up in the counting. Am I still breathing in? It's been 7 seconds. Okay, now I can release. That I'm not even finding a benefit in the breathing because I'm so focused on the counts. What we do see consistently is breathing in from the nose and then breathing out through the mouth and using your diaphragm or your stomach and not your mouth. So when you're hyperventilating, which is what I was doing, you're all up here. The breaths are quick, and it's not necessarily getting your body relaxed. When it comes from the diaphragm, it's and what I teach is it's important that the breathing out is going to be a little bit longer than the breathe in. Otherwise, you could have an issue where you start to pass out if you're not careful. And also making sure that if you're walking while you're doing this, just be careful because you can kind of get lightheaded depending on especially if you're doing it a little bit wrong. It's easy to get kind of tipsy and then just kind of fall right over, and you don't want that while you're walking. So I'll kind of give you a couple different breaths, and I'll show you what it looks like and feels like. A couple of things you notice is I slowly got longer as my breaths kept going. And then what you'll also notice is roughly you want to do it for about 2 minutes a day. And actually the practice is more impactful than just doing it in the moment. So if you're sitting in the ER and you're stressed out, you can do a breathing exercise, but it's not going to calm your body down as quick as practicing consistently on a daily basis. That's where you're going to get the relief from the overflow. What we do see from research is people who are willing to practice breathing exercises 2 minutes a day, especially those who are having panic attacks. So the panic attack is going to be, you feel like you're having a heart attack, your heart's racing, people often feel like they are dying. And using a breathing exercises, for people who have been repeatedly practicing those, are able to calm their body down within 10 to 15 minutes when they're effectively using breathing exercises.
And I've personally found that combining both those at bedtime when you lay down at night can be very helpful. I found that breathing exercise is good to do when I'm trying to fall back to sleep too a lot of times at night. And the muscle relaxation thing can also be a very good way to prepare your body to rest at night and sleep. So even if you set aside right as you go to bed to do some of that, you'll find it really will help with some of that. And like I say, I've wrestled with this a lot of my life with worry and the concerns, and I found these helpful, especially at night when I'm trying to fall back to sleep.
Yeah. So the next two, the counting and refocusing, we'll take kind of together. So what we see with anxiety and depression is anxiety tends to always be thinking, not always, but tends to often be thinking of the future. Oh, am I going to get to pay that bill? What's going on in that relationship? What's going on at work? And that anxieties are what we ruminate over. Whereas depression can kind of feel like we're looking backwards. We're always thinking about, oh, I just wish this would have happened, or oh, the regrets sometimes we live in the past. So with counting and refocusing, really it's just about taking that and trying to just kind of push it away for a little bit. So the counting is, I want to focus on the here and now and not anywhere else. So we're not going to necessarily walk you through, you all know how to count, but it's focusing on the numbers as you walk all the way down. And as soon as you find yourself, ruminating or going back into, oh, I thought about that thing that was really stressing me out, trying to ground yourself back. And that's what we just call it with refocusing. One of the things that, we don't love technology. It has a lot of negatives when it comes to mental health, but there are benefits. And one of the benefits we have found is people have created hundreds and thousands of apps out there. And there are hundreds and thousands of apps that are related to counting, breathing relaxations, calm space kind of stuff. And what they're really doing is they're helping you refocus and keep in the moment to kind of calm your body down. And I would encourage people, if that's something that, you like those apps kind of things, use those apps to help. I think the iPhone has ones these days. A lot of the other off-brand, which is what I have, also has the same kind of breathing and slowing your breath down as well. The final one we'll kind of look at is called grounding. And this is what we call 5 sense kind of keeping you in the here and now. The grounding exercise comes from what we call dialectical behavioral therapy, and it's being able to take stress actually and be okay with it. And so we do that by first keeping ourselves in the present, which is what we do with the grounding. And so grounding is taking our 5 senses and bringing us back to the present. So I'm going to ask for a little bit audience participation if you guys are up for it. And we're going to name, for the first one, 5 things. You can just call it out. 5 things you guys are seeing around you. Wood. Carpet. Maybe name some colors, too, associated with what you're seeing.
Blue light.
A blue light. 2 more. Stained glass. I'm sorry? People. Yeah. And so those are 5 things we can see. Let's try to name 4 things you guys can feel or touch around you. So, for example, I might say, I feel soft leather. What's another one someone can feel something around them? A pen.
Shirt.
Cloth. Yep. Shirt. One more. Hard pew. Yeah. And so what you're focusing on there is textures. You're focusing on is it soft? Is it flexible? Is it rigid? Is it hard? Let's move on to 3 things we can hear. Yeah? A foot tapping. Heavy. The light. A little buzz from the light. Absolutely. So which light, where are we on now? We're on 2 things you can smell, which can be often harder. So this is the reason we go down. We go to the harder ones as we go down. So 2 things you can smell. For example, for me, it would be cold coffee. Yep, still cold. So you smell your breath. Exactly. And then one thing you can taste. By no means am I telling people to lick things around them. Not sanitary. But what we do see is when your stress level is getting high, walking yourself through all these 5 things. And the numbers don't matter. If you're just picking one thing you can see, one thing you can hear, it's just a way to kind of slowly walk yourself down. What you're doing, though, is you're focusing on the present because you almost have to. You have to look around you. You have to touch things. You have to kind of really focus your smell, really focus what you're hearing. And what that's going on is it brings your body back down. So the last one that we talk about is just the taste. And the funny thing about the research that they did was, so when we get overloaded with stress and our body or our mind starts to shut down into the sense where we're going fight, flight, or freeze, it's in what we call survival mode. So the body's trying to figure out, is this serious? Do we need to fight? Do we need to freeze? Or are we going to flee? And what happens is when you start using things like your throat muscles and you're drinking something or you're tasting something, the body all of a sudden sends signals back to the brain. Wait, we can't be drinking and still be, necessarily in danger, so maybe we are okay. And so the body is actually a little bit quicker to kind of slowing itself back down and start to say, okay, we're safer than we thought we were. And so it's actually a way to trick your brain in a sense to have someone drink something. Since I learned this, actually, I have been having my 4-year-old constantly have little bottles of water when she starts getting overly emotionally overwhelmed. Hey, drink some water. That'll make you feel better. And so she loves to go drink water now.
So all these are just tools for you to try. Some of them may work for you, some may not. But what we encourage you is try them this week. Try one that you think will work. So, if you're experiencing a lot of the physical experiences, then try some of the ones that are more physical. If you're in your head a lot, then try some of the ones that are really trying to help you release some of that stress in your head. So they're all going to be different, but these are all proven to be helpful to people. So that's our encouragement. We brought these tools because we want you to walk away today to better manage the stress you're dealing with. But we also want to recognize, we want to talk a little bit about what happens when some of these tools and my own coping mechanisms, what happens when that's not enough? When do I need to go and maybe find someone to help me with that? So Grant, what are some of the things that you would say as far as when do I need to get someone like you involved in my life to help me out?
So I kind of mentioned in the very beginning that one of my backgrounds is in trauma. And so one of the things that we have seen with COVID kind of occurring is people's traumas have been triggered that sometimes they've dealt with or sometimes they never dealt with. All of a sudden putting them in isolation in a home, or they can't interact, or also even just having masks and trying to read people and having that mask over their face can be re-traumatizing for people. And so one of the things that we've noticed is a lot more of trauma has been coming up for people, and that's leading to sometimes anxiety and depression. So one of the things I would say is if you find the instability or for the anxiety is kind of creating past memories for you, like, oh, I don't think I ever really dealt with that. That can be a sign that maybe getting some professional help can be a good sign too.
And some of that trauma can be stuff that you go back to your childhood. Things that happen to you from 0 to 18 can be very impactful. Maybe you put them away, or maybe you thought you dealt with them one time. But in crisis situations like this, they can pop back up and create new things that you have to deal with and work with. What are some of the other maybe red lines?
Yeah. So one of the things that's kind of changed in the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years of just the therapy world is, one, the stigmatization is slowly lifting of people just going to therapy. It's still a long way off. We still see that. But what we're seeing is the mentality is shifting, which is, I think, a very healthy mentality, and that is people used to think, well, a therapist is someone that I go for trauma, and I see them once a week, I see them every week until I'm healed or until I'm better. And that's not what we're seeing anymore. We're seeing, people tend to go what works for them. Sometimes that's once a week, sometimes that's every other week, sometimes it's once a month or even once a quarter. And then we have some people who are like, you know what, I'll just go in when I feel like I need a touch-up, or I just need to kind of process with somebody. And so, one of the shifts that we're seeing is it's almost looking like you would a medical or a doctor visit. So with a doctor visit, hopefully you're not doing what I did and waiting until you go to the ER to address situations. Hopefully you're going for that that yearly checkup. You get your body checked, make sure it's in working order, and then you go. And we're seeing people do that now with mental health. Going in, seeing a counselor, just getting a checkup, assessing if there's anything, and then being okay and moving on.
And I can testify that for Grant. I've befriended one of Grant's clients. He doesn't even probably know that, but he's in that mode where he's not in crisis right now. He's not dealing with anything big, but he's just finding it very beneficial to have that time to talk through and deal with things that's bringing real calm and peace to his life. In a time that could be a turmoil, but he didn't let it get there before he sought out some help.
Yeah. The final one I think is kind of big is we're seeing a lot more parents bringing their kids in. And, one of the things is we often always care about how our kids are handling things. And with all the stress and the anxiety, kids have a very different level, different size cup than we do. They might even have, a little tiny cup. And so their stress easily overloads. And sometimes, one of the things, parents may not always be able to have those skills to say, this is what will work. And sometimes you try all these things and you keep them accountable and they're still not working. And so we're seeing a big uptick of parents bringing kids in because of COVID and because of all the anxiety that they're dealing with. And just, I can't imagine trying to do school online and not seeing the friends anymore, but it's creating anxiety, it's creating a lot of adjustment issues.
Does anyone have any questions about the counseling process or counseling in and of itself, or why maybe Christian counseling is different than counselors who aren't Christians? Anybody have any questions?
Habits, I guess, that you described. You mentioned children.
I would try all of them. Like most things, not everything is going to work for every child. And so I always tell people, use what works, and you don't need to use what's not working because there's no need. But yeah, I would some of the ones that were more simple, the counting, the refocusing, and getting them to kind of try to calm themselves with maybe breathing, are what we tend to see with kids more often.
And the refocusing one was one that we not only used as helping our kids with mental health issues, but also dealing with situations where they're not really shouldn't be in discipline. So learning how to refocus, help kids refocus, and using some of these tools, that can also be very beneficial in a discipline situation. But that became a big part of our working with our kids. Refocus and then go back later and let's talk about it once all the emotion and everything's gone. But yeah, all these can be habits that you can customize. I mean, it's funny when you talk about counting. We all grew up with people talk about counting sheep. Well, it kind of felt like a silly thing, but in reality, there's the truth of counting sheep. It's a way to refocus your mind and work and do things. So teaching your kids some of those things. Maybe it's count the cars going by us or whatever. Learning how to let's refocus. If it's a meltdown they're having, then let's refocus by counting the tiles on the ceiling. So coming up with creative ways to also help kids apply these can be very, very effective. It can help them as they go into adulthood. Anybody else have a question? I'm going to say some of the frequently asked questions. If you work with Crosswinds, if you contact us, we've got multiple ways to contact our people. You can call us, numbers on the brochure. You can go on our website, and you'll find we have a text number. You can text us and say, hey, I need help. Maybe you just don't feel like calling, picking up that phone, it's just overwhelming. You can text and say, I need help, and one of our people will get in touch with you. You can also do the same thing by filling out a form online, or send an email to us and say, hey, I need help, and we'll help you get that initiated. Our intake people will talk you through the process. They'll help you understand, how do we pay for this? They'll talk to you about insurance, if your insurance will pay for services. We're a nonprofit organization. Faith is very important to us, and so one of the ways we try to minister to people is we're constantly raising funds that we use to help subsidize people who can't afford counseling. So if you're not sure, if you're in a difficult place, talk to our intake person. They can talk to you, and maybe financially it's our big issue. We can maybe find a way to help you out. So the other part is getting into counseling doesn't mean you're committing to something every week, twice a week. Counseling is customized for each and every person. As we shared, some people can go in 2 or 3 times, walk with counseling, life goes on, and they're able to move on and go on with things. For some people, they need to go in every week or a couple times a week, and they need to really, when they're dealing with a real crisis, need to talk it through. But it's different for everyone. So don't be fearful. It's like, well, if I do this, I got to go every week or whatever. We're going to work with you to figure out what works best for you. And when you call our intake person, they're going to talk to you a little bit about your issue, what you're concerned about. They don't get into great detail, but they get just enough so they can match you up with one of our counselors that's going to be best equipped to work with you. We don't have a big pad of counselors that we just say, oh, you need counseling? Here's an open spot. We're going to stick you here. We don't do that. We're going to stick you with one of our counselors that has expertise and has experience with what you're dealing with. And one of the nice things is counseling now can be done virtually online. And they found out it's just as effective many times as being in person. So if we don't have someone in our Indianapolis office, we have 14 counselors up in Fort Wayne that maybe one of those counselors is better suited to work with you, and we'll do it virtually. So we've got ways to help. There's no one right fit for everyone. It's customized, and we make sure that helps, that happens. Anything else I'm missing on those thoughts?
No, I think you got it.
Well, to wrap up tonight, I want to revisit, go back to talking about Elijah and Job and David. And each one of those persons found themselves in a very dark place. A place where they couldn't come up with the answers. And God worked with them in supernatural ways to impact their lives. To Elijah, he came in a whisper. To Job, he came in and he laid out how it was. With David, he had multiple ways that he dealt with David. We kind of think, well, those are all supernatural things. And I want to remind you that the coming of Christ brought something supernatural to all our lives, and that's the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit can work through a lot of different processes. Sometimes we can pray about something, the Holy Spirit speaks to us, and we can deal with it on our own. Sometimes the Holy Spirit works through Pastor Matt, and he says something up here, and it speaks into your life, and it helps deal with the situation. Sometimes it's something you hear on the radio or a song. But most of the time it's to another person. And God has equipped people to be counselors in this world. He's given them that gift, and then they've also went out and got training. And so, if you need help, and you want to find help, again, one of the things I want to encourage you is that we already have Christian counselors. They have a relationship with Christ, and they're going to let the Holy Spirit work through them to help touch your life. So I don't know. Hopefully, like I say, we hope you're able to look at the dashboard. We gave you some tools here, and you can clear the lights off your dashboard with some of those tools. But if you find yourself or you have a friend who does need some help, we would love to be able to be the person and the group that can help you out to get you through those tough situations. Let me pray for us, and then we're going to hang around here. If you have specific questions, feel free to come up, and we'll be glad to address any specific questions you have. Heavenly Father, thank you for this night and this chance to speak to this group of people. And Father, I just pray that you will begin to work in their lives and answer their requests, whether it's them that's dealing with, they're the person that's dealing with the anxiety, or they have a friend or a loved one that they're seeing go through this, that you'll begin to answer their prayer by helping give them answers to help this person get through that struggle. And Father, I just thank you that you give people like Grant and others on our team of counselors to reach into people's lives, to make a difference, to help them be transformed by the renewing of their minds, and no longer conformed to the thoughts and the things of this world. So we just thank you and we praise you, Lord. We thank you for your gracious gift of life that you give to us. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you so much.